It begins in silence, the kind of silence that hums, alive and breathing through the narrow gaps of hotel walls. The narrator's voice is soft, hushed like a confession whispered into the dark. He speaks about how hotels are not built on foundations, but on memories, fragments of human lives that drift in and out, leaving traces that never quite fade. Every room, he says, remembers the laughter, the sobbing, the arguments muffled by wallpaper too thin to contain human sorrow. The sound of zippers, of footsteps dragging across carpet, of television static at 2 in the morning. All of it lingers. Hotels are not temporary. Only the guests are. A dimly lit hallway stretches endlessly in both directions, bathed in the faint gold of dying light bulbs. The air is still, thick with the scent of detergent and faint cigarette smoke. A cleaning cart sits abandoned halfway down the corridor, its wheel creaking gently every few seconds as if moved by a draft that doesn't exist. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings, soft and uncertain, as though rung by a trembling hand. The echo fades, swallowed by the stillness. The narrator's tone grows heavier, carrying the rhythm of footsteps walking toward something unseen. He tells us that people trust hotels because they feel neutral, clean, safe. Strangers pass through, sleep, and leave without knowing the histories of the pillows beneath their heads. But what if those rooms are never truly empty? What if the walls remember every sound, every heartbeat, and every final breath taken within them? The question hangs like fog, and the quiet hum of unease begins to grow. Rain begins to fall outside. The faint patter against glass windows forms a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The camera drifts through an empty lobby, the flicker of a broken neon sign casting pale red light across polished floors. A desk bell sits untouched, the brass tarnished by years of fingerprints now long gone. The shadows stretch unnaturally, making the furniture appear taller, older, almost human in their stillness. The sound of distant thunder rolls in, and the narrator's voice lowers, almost mournful. Every hotel, he murmurs, is a collection of unfinished stories. Some are left behind willingly, others refuse to end. The scene shifts, a montage of doors, some pristine and freshly painted, others scarred, their numbers faded or scratched away. Each door represents a life, a story sealed within 4 walls. One door creaks open slightly, revealing only darkness. A whisper escapes from inside, faint, almost like breath against the ear. It says nothing clear, just the suggestion of a voice, the idea that someone might still be there, waiting for the night clerk who never comes. The narrator speaks again, almost like he's remembering something personal. He says he stayed in hundreds of hotels, small roadside motels, grand luxury towers, and nameless inns tucked between highways. And in every one he's felt it. That moment when you first step into your room, when the door clicks shut, and the silence greets you. You pause, sensing something unseen, like walking into someone else's dream. That stillness isn't peace. It's memory. The soundscape deepens, faint murmurs under the static, like overlapping whispers layered beneath the rainfall. The camera glides past old photographs on the hallway walls, sepia faces of guests from decades ago, smiling stiffly. For a heartbeat, one of them seems to move, eyes shifting toward the camera. The light flickers and the image is still again. The narrator says softly, maybe some guests never checked out. Maybe they're still waiting, for the room service that never came, for the apology that never arrived, for the last night that never ended. The air grows colder. The hum of the old fluorescent lights begins to pulse, slower, heavier. The scene narrows down to one hallway door, slightly ajar, the room number barely legible. The camera moves closer, the darkness inside pulsing like a heartbeat. The narrator pauses, the silence stretching until it's uncomfortable, then whispers the final line. Tonight, you'll check into 10 rooms you'll never forget. The sound of a key turning echoes sharply, followed by the slow creak of a door opening. A breath of cold air rushes out. The rain outside stops. The static hum fades into the sound of something distant. A faint, rhythmic knock. 3 times. Slow. Deliberate. The lights flicker once more and then cut to black. Static fills the screen for a moment before the sound of an old service bell rings once. Clear and final. The story begins. The rain came down in thin, silver threads that night, tracing the windows of the old downtown hotel like trembling fingers. The lobby was nearly empty, save for the sleepy night clerk scrolling absently through his phone and the soft, constant hum of a vending machine that never seemed to shut off. When Daniel Harper stepped through the glass doors, suitcase dragging behind him, he looked like a man running from something, or maybe toward something he couldn't quite name. His tie hung loose, shirt half untucked, and his eyes carried the dull sheen of someone who hadn't slept in days. He told the clerk he needed a room, just for the night. His voice was hoarse, the kind that comes from too much silence. The clerk didn't ask questions. Hotels rarely do. They're made for people who don't want to explain. Within minutes, Daniel was handed a brass key with the number 308 etched faintly into it. The key felt colder than it should have, heavier too. The elevator groaned as it climbed. The hallway on the third floor stretched long and narrow, the carpet patterned with faded gold swirls that looked like they might have once been elegant. Somewhere down the corridor, a door clicked shut. Then silence again, that heavy, expectant kind that sits on the chest. Inside his room, the air was stale. A single yellow lamp buzzed weakly on the desk beside the bed. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the faint scent of mildew clung to the curtains. Daniel set down his suitcase, loosened his collar, and stared at the mirror opposite the bed. It reflected him too perfectly, the dim lamplight framing his tired face like a painting. He rubbed his eyes and reached for the phone. Room service. Maybe a sandwich, maybe coffee, something warm to push away the feeling that he was still out in the rain. The line crackled when he called. A voice answered, calm and polite. A woman. Room service. What would you like tonight, Mr. Harper? He blinked. He hadn't given his name. Just a club sandwich. And black coffee. Of course, the voice said. We remember you. Static hummed. Then silence. He frowned, setting the phone down. The words felt wrong, like something you dream and forget halfway through waking. He brushed it off, turned on the TV, only static, no channels. The wind rattled the windows, and the light flickered once before steadying. He checked his watch. Midnight exactly. Then a knock. He crossed to the door, expecting the tray, but when he opened it, the hallway was empty. Only the echo of the rain on the glass. But there was a silver platter on the floor, shining faintly under the hallway light. The lid reflected the dim glow, warped like mercury. He hesitated before lifting it. No sandwich. No coffee. Only a folded note placed neatly in the center. For words, written in jagged black ink. We remember you. His heart began to hammer. A mistake, maybe a prank. He stepped out, glancing both ways down the corridor. The lights stretched on endlessly, humming faintly. Every door looked the same. Closed. Waiting. He called out, hello. His voice didn't carry. It fell flat, swallowed by carpet and walls that felt too close. When he turned back, the platter was gone. The hallway was bare again, like nothing had ever been there. Back inside, the phone began to ring. The sound cut through the room. Sharp, relentless, mechanical. He picked it up, pressed it to his ear, but all he heard was faint breathing. Who is this? A pause. Then a voice, almost identical to his own, whispered, you shouldn't have come back. He dropped the receiver, stumbling backward until his legs hit the bed. The line was still open, the faint hum of static and breath blending into something that almost sounded like words he couldn't understand. He grabbed his coat, heart pounding, and moved toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The lock turned, but the handle wouldn't budge, as if someone on the other side was holding it closed. The lights began to flicker again, longer this time, the shadows shifting across the room like figures just out of sight. He turned toward the mirror. It rippled faintly, as though underwater. His reflection stood still, staring back at him, even when he wasn't moving. Slowly, its mouth began to curl into a faint, knowing smile. Then the reflection lifted its hand, holding something silver and shining. Platter. The lights went out completely. The only sound left was the phone, still ringing, steady and rhythmic in the darkness. He reached out in the dark for the receiver, but the moment his hand brushed it, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, faintly, a voice spoke from the darkness, from right behind him. "Room service, sir." The lights flickered back on for an instant. His reflection stood where he had been, holding the tray with the note, "We remember you." The glass cracked, splintering into hundreds of tiny fractures. His mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. Downstairs, the clerk looked up from his phone at the sound of the elevator dinging. The doors opened slowly, revealing an empty lift. On the floor lay a single silver platter, spotless and gleaming, with a folded note resting in the center. The clerk hesitated before reading it. For words, the same as before. "We remember you." A low hum filled the lobby lights, making them flicker. The elevator doors closed on their own, the sound echoing into the silence. Outside, the rain stopped, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, faintly, just beneath the hum, the sound of a phone ringing again. Some rooms, the narrator whispers, don't serve food, only guilt. The hum of the vacuum cleaner had become the soundtrack of her nights. Every evening, as the guests drifted off into their soft, air-conditioned dreams, Maria slipped quietly through the hotel's corridors, her cart rattling softly, her gloved hands steady, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She had worked at the Wilburn Inn for 16 years, though lately, the years had begun to blur together. Every room looked the same. Every smell, every stain, every shadow had become familiar. Yet there was something different tonight. Something wrong in the way the air hung still, too heavy, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The clock in the hallway showed 2:13 a.m. when she began cleaning room 214. The couple staying there had checked out earlier that afternoon, leaving behind the usual mess. Crumpled sheets, lipstick on the glasses, an unfinished bottle of wine. She moved efficiently, humming an old tune under her breath, a song her grandmother used to sing back home. But when she pulled the sheets off the mattress, she froze. Beneath the thin white fabric, the padding was stained dark, almost black in the dim light, the smell faintly metallic. She frowned, reached for her rag, and began scrubbing. But no matter how hard she pressed, the stain didn't fade. It just seemed to spread, like it was seeping upward, alive. She muttered to herself, her voice barely a whisper. Another leak from the pipes. Always the pipes. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The smell told her otherwise. Iron, copper, blood. When she finally stepped back, the mattress looked clean again. Pristine even. She sighed, sprayed air freshener, and moved on. Yet when she reached the next room, room 215, her eyes caught something odd in the corner of her vision. A faint, wet footprint leading from 214's door to the next. She blinked, heart quickening, and followed it. The footprints stopped at the base of her cleaning cart. She looked down. The floor beneath was dry. She tried to shake it off. She had seen stranger things working nights, drunk guests sleepwalking, things left behind in drawers that were better not asked about. Still, a chill ran down her spine as she opened room 215. It looked untouched, yet somehow used. The bed was perfectly made, the blinds half open, letting in the glow of the flickering streetlight outside. Dust floated in the air like slow snowflakes. She felt watched. As she began dusting the dresser, she noticed the picture frame on the wall was crooked. She reached to straighten it and froze. The reflection in the glass wasn't hers. The figure in the reflection was wearing her uniform, her name tag, but the woman's face was pale and hollow, her eyes sunken, her mouth open as if mid-scream. Maria stumbled backward, knocking her supplies onto the carpet. When she looked again, the reflection was normal. Her own tired face stared back. She told herself she was just imagining things. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe she needed to rest. But the strangest part wasn't what she saw. It was what she heard. A voice, faint and echoing through the vent near the bed. It was whispering her name. Softly, tenderly, like a mother calling her child home. Maria! Her heart pounded. She dropped the cloth and knelt to listen closer. The vent smelled faintly of bleach and dust. Maria! The voice repeated. This time she recognized it. It was her own voice. She stumbled backward again, shaking her head. No, this wasn't real. She needed to get out, take a break, maybe have a cigarette by the loading dock. But as she reached the door, her radio crackled to life. A soft static, then the faint sound of overlapping whispers. 2:14, 2:15, 2:16. It repeated in a monotone rhythm, counting upward, one room at a time. The voice on the radio sounded like hers. Then, after a long pause, it said one final number. 214 again. She turned back down the hallway. The door to 214 was open. The light inside flickered weakly. Her heart thudded so loud it drowned out everything else. She inched forward, her shoes squeaking against the carpet. Inside, the room looked spotless again, too spotless. The bed remade, the curtains drawn. But the air felt thick, humming with something electric. Then she saw it. A cleaning rag on the nightstand, folded neatly, with her name stitched in red thread. She didn't carry personalized cloths. None of the staff did. Her hand trembled as she reached for her ID badge. But the metal tag was old, rusted around the edges. The photo was faded, the name half worn away. The year printed below it read 1996. Her breath hitched. She hadn't even been living in this city back then. The intercom near the ceiling crackled, and the voice of the manager, a voice she hadn't heard in years, echoed faintly through the static. Maria, dear, thank you for your service. You've done such a wonderful job keeping the rooms clean all these years. The line hissed, then faded into silence. She backed toward the door, whispering to herself that this was a dream, that she would wake up soon. But when she turned the knob, the hallway was gone. The door opened to another identical room, 214 again. Everywhere she looked, the same bed, the same mirror, the same faint stain beneath the sheets, the same sound of the vacuum humming from somewhere just behind the wall. Panic clawed at her throat as she ran toward the next door. Another 214. Then another. Endless. The hallway had become a loop, a maze of repetition, her footsteps echoing louder with every desperate turn. Finally, she stopped. Her hands trembled as she looked back at the first door. On the brass plate, scratched faintly beneath the number, she saw words that made her blood run cold. Missing Staff Memorial Wing. In the silence that followed, she began to remember. The faint flash of water, the smell of bleach, the accident that had never made the news. A fall, a head strike, a body found weeks later under a bed in one of the rooms she had cleaned herself. Her breathing quickened. The light above flickered again, and she saw movement in the mirror. Not her reflection this time, but a dozen figures behind her. All wearing hotel uniforms. All staring silently. Their eyes hollow, faces gray. One of them, in the front, smiled faintly. It was her. The vacuum hum stopped. The silence returned, heavy and infinite. Slowly, she turned to face the reflection again. The woman in the mirror leaned forward and whispered something through cracked lips. Some employees never clock out. The lights went out. The sound of the vacuum restarted somewhere far down the hall, faint but steady, as if the cleaning shift had begun again. The sun had long since disappeared behind the jagged skyline of Bangkok, leaving the city soaked in the kind of darkness that hums with electricity and dust. The narrow alleys outside the Kanara hostel glowed in the red wash of paper lanterns, the air thick with humidity, fried garlic, and the faint, rhythmic buzz of insects. Liam, a 24-year-old backpacker from Melbourne, dragged his duffel bag through the cracked tiles of the hostel's lobby, his shoulders aching from weeks on the road. He was tired, broke, and a little drunk from the cheap rum he'd shared with strangers down the street. The woman at the front desk smiled with that familiar blend of politeness and distance. She checked him in with minimal English, slid a brass key across the counter, and pointed toward the narrow staircase that led to the upper floors. The number etched on the key was 307. He thanked her, slung his bag over his shoulder, and climbed the stairs. The sound of each footstep echoed oddly, as though the walls were too narrow and too close together. The hallway upstairs was long, lined with old wooden doors and buzzing fluorescent lights that flickered in uneven pulses. The air smelled faintly of rain and incense. When Liam found room 307, he noticed something strange. The spacing between 306 and 308 wasn't right. A narrow sliver of wall sat between them, not wide enough to fit a door, but too large to be nothing. It was like the architecture had swallowed something. He ran his hand along the wallpaper and felt a faint indentation, almost like the outline of a hidden frame. His pulse quickened. Curiosity was one of his worst habits. He unlocked his room, tossed his bag onto the bed, and took a moment to breathe. The fan overhead squealed in lazy circles. The sheets were clean but thin, the kind that always felt slightly damp no matter how long the air conditioner ran. He took a shower, trying to wash off the sweat and the ache of travel. When he came out, towel slung around his neck, he noticed something reflected in the window. A light, a glow, faint and golden, coming from the section of wall he'd touched earlier. He turned, heart beginning to beat faster. The wallpaper there was peeling at the corner, just slightly. Beneath it, the faint shimmer of metal, a doorknob. Hidden, painted over. The hallway had a secret door. He stood there for a moment, debating. It was late. He should sleep, but the quiet thrill of discovery won out. He grabbed his pocket knife, carefully peeled away the wallpaper, and revealed an old brass handle, tarnished and cold. The knob turned easily. The door opened inward, soundless. Beyond it was darkness. Not the ordinary kind, but thick, heavy, absolute. A darkness that seemed to swallow the weak beam of his phone's flashlight. "Hello?" he called softly, but his voice didn't echo. It just vanished. He stepped inside. The air changed. The smell of his own room, detergent, damp fabric, disappeared. This air was still untouched, sterile. When he lifted his phone higher, his breath caught. The room was an exact copy of his own. Same bed, same curtains, same small desk by the wall. But the details were off. The sheets were folded differently. A pair of sandals sat neatly by the door. A suitcase rested open on the bed. Not his. Inside were clothes that looked exactly like his own, folded neatly with a passport sitting on top. His passport. He froze, pulse hammering. He looked around, scanning for a mirror or reflection, anything that could explain the trick, the illusion. Then he heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind the wall where his room should have been. He turned off his flashlight instinctively, heart pounding in the darkness. The footsteps stopped. He waited. The silence was unbearable. Then a sound. The door creaked open behind him, faint light spilling in from the hallway. Someone stepped inside his real room. He could hear them drop their bag onto the floor, shuffle around, unzip something. His breath came shallow and quick. Slowly, he approached the hidden door again, peeking through the thin crack. His own face looked back. Liam, or whatever was wearing his face, stood in his room, stretching his arms as though testing the body for the first time. The light flickered once, and for a split second, the reflection in the window showed both of them, perfectly aligned, like twins in parallel frames. The double smiled, small and deliberate, then tilted its head toward the hidden door, directly toward him. Liam stumbled backward, knocking over the suitcase on the bed. The sound echoed unnaturally loud. The double's head snapped sharply, eyes narrowing. It began to move toward the wall, each step perfectly synchronized with his racing heartbeat. He turned, running toward the opposite end of the room, but there was no door there anymore, just an endless expanse of wallpaper and wood. His phone flickered, the flashlight dying with a faint buzz. The double's footsteps grew louder, closer. Then the voice, his own, called softly from beyond the wall. "Why did you come back, Liam?" He pressed himself against the cold plaster, tears blurring his vision. "This isn't real," he whispered. But the wall pulsed faintly beneath his palms, warm and alive. A whisper, barely audible, crawled through the air. "You left us here." The light above him blinked once more, and suddenly, everything shifted. The walls dissolved, and he was back in his own room, or what looked like it. His bag was on the bed again, untouched. The fan spun lazily overhead. For a long moment, he stood still, shaking, unable to move. Then, trying to steady himself, he turned toward the mirror to convince himself everything was fine. His reflection stared back, pale and trembling. But behind it, faintly visible, was another figure standing in the same room, smiling. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway again, but this time they came from both directions. He grabbed his key, trying to open the door, but the lock refused to turn. Then a soft knock. Once, twice, 3 times. He froze. When he opened the door, the hallway outside was gone. Only another door stood in front of him, identical to his. He stepped through instinctively, desperate for light, for anything real, but found himself back where he started. Room 307. The air in his lungs felt thick. He stumbled toward the window, trying to open it, but outside there was no city. Just rows upon rows of doors stretching endlessly, each one marked with a number. 307. 307. 307. He began to scream. The sound didn't echo. It just dissolved into the air, like everything else. Downstairs, the receptionist looked up as the elevator doors opened. A young man stepped out. Same clothes, same tired eyes, dragging a duffel bag that dripped faintly with water. He smiled politely, asked for a room, just for the night. She nodded, handed him the brass key for room 307, and wrote his name down in the ledger. When she looked at the page, she frowned. The same name had already been written there, over and over, each entry dated years apart. Liam Harper. Same handwriting. Same shaky signature. As the man walked up the stairs, the receptionist thought she heard something faint behind her. A whisper, soft and almost kind. Some doors are meant to be passed, not entered. The town of Ashbrook was small enough that you could drive through it in under 5 minutes and never notice the old motor lodge by the highway. Its neon sign buzzed weakly, "Sleep Easy Motel." Though half the letters had burned out years ago, most travelers who stopped there did so out of necessity, not choice. A last resort for people who had been driving too long, running from too much, or hiding from something they couldn't name. On that quiet November night, a cold mist rolled through the parking lot, and the only sound was the wind slipping through the broken soda machine. Evelyn Pierce parked her dusty sedan near the lobby and killed the engine. She was a journalist, 43, tired, and too deep into a story that was starting to feel like it was watching her back. She was investigating the legend of Room 17, the room that had been locked for nearly 50 years. Locals whispered that it hadn't been cleaned, entered, or even touched since the night of a disappearance. The motel's owner refused to talk about it. Guests claimed to see light flicker under the door at odd hours. And some said, if you stood outside long enough, you could hear someone whispering from inside, asking for help. Evelyn didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in mysteries, and the more people told her not to look, the more determined she became. Inside the lobby, the air smelled faintly of coffee and dust. The old woman at the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle, her gray hair tied in a loose bun. "Just you tonight?" she asked, her voice gentle but wary. "Just me," Evelyn replied, flashing a polite smile. "Do you have any rooms available?" "All but 17, the woman said quickly. "That one stays locked. Maintenance issue." Evelyn pretended to nod, though she was already planning otherwise. Her room was small, barely big enough for the bed and a table. The wallpaper had yellowed with age, and the heater clicked every few seconds, sounding like a heartbeat that refused to die. She unpacked her recorder, notebook, and flashlight, and stared at the wall that separated her from room 17. She could almost feel the cold radiating through it. Around 2 a.m., she finally decided to move. She slipped out into the hallway, the carpet damp and soft beneath her feet. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Room 17 was at the very end, its number plate missing, the door slightly discolored. Dust had settled around the frame like a protective border. Evelyn ran her fingers along the wood. Cold, too cold for a closed room. She pressed her ear against it and held her breath. Nothing. Then faintly a sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping. 3 knocks. Then silence. She swallowed hard, then pulled a small lockpick set from her bag. She wasn't proud of how easily the latch turned. The door creaked open, exhaling a stale, heavy breath, like something had been holding it shut for years. Her flashlight cut through the dark, revealing a perfectly preserved room, as if someone had left just yesterday. A suitcase sat open on the bed, clothes neatly folded inside. A cup of coffee, long since evaporated, sat on the desk beside a newspaper dated November 8, 1973. The window was boarded shut from the outside. Her hands trembled slightly as she snapped photos. Dust motes floated through the beam of her flashlight like snow. Everything looked eerily untouched except for one thing. On the mirror above the dresser, faint words had been written in condensation, even though the glass was bone dry. "Do not disturb." Evelyn froze. The temperature dropped instantly, her breath misting in front of her. The door behind her creaked as if touched by unseen fingers. She turned, the beam of light shaking across the walls. "Hello?" she whispered. No answer, just the faint hum of the heater next door. She moved toward the desk, heart hammering. The newspaper headline read, "Man vanishes from Sleep Easy Motel, room sealed, pending investigation." Below it, a grainy photograph of a man in his 30s, smiling faintly. The name beneath made her blood run cold. Arthur Pierce. Her father. She staggered backward, flashlight flickering. It didn't make sense. Her father had left when she was a child. Her mother always said he'd walked out, disappeared, started a new life. She never mentioned this place, this room. Her vision blurred with sudden tears. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, but when she looked toward the boarded window, the boards were gone, replaced by glass. Behind it, a figure stood in the darkness. A man, watching her. The beam of her light found his face. Pale. Familiar. Her father's eyes staring back through 50 years of dust. She stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut on its own, the latch clicking into place. The room filled with a low hum, like electricity buzzing through the walls. The mirror rippled. Slowly, she turned back toward it. The words, "Do not disturb," had vanished. In their place was a reflection of the bed, and on it the silhouette of a man sitting perfectly still, his back turned to her. She raised her flashlight. "Dad!" The figure turned. The face was wrong. Smiling too wide, eyes too black. The same shape, the same clothes, but no humanity behind it. Its voice, when it spoke, was soft and calm, layered with static. "You shouldn't have come back." Evelyn screamed and lunged for the door, slamming her shoulder against it until it burst open. She ran into the hall, breathing hard, turning to look back. But the door to room 17 was shut again, pristine, as if it had never been touched. She collapsed against the opposite wall, trembling, tears streaking her face. Her flashlight flickered, dying. In the silence, she heard something faint, a whisper from behind the door. "Do not disturb." By morning, Evelyn's car was gone from the lot. The motel owner found her key neatly placed on the counter, a folded $20 bill beneath it for room 16. When she opened the register to record the payment, her pen slipped from her hand. Room 17's key was missing. Later that week, a truck driver checked in during a storm. The owner gave him room 15. As he carried his bag down the hallway, he noticed something odd. The door beside his was open just a crack. A faint golden light spilled out, flickering gently. He thought he heard a voice, soft and distant, like someone calling from a dream. "Please help me." When he looked back, the light was gone, and the door to room 17 was closed again. The words "Do not disturb" freshly printed on the sign. Sometimes, the manager would swear she heard typing coming from inside late at night, the rhythmic click of an old recorder, and the voice of a woman whispering her own questions into the dark. Sometimes stories write themselves in blood. The Pacific Crest Hotel sat alone on a cliff overlooking the restless ocean, its glass walls shimmering faintly in the fog like a memory that refused to fade. Once hailed as a marvel of modern architecture, it had aged poorly, all cold steel and forgotten luxury. The salt air had begun to corrode its balconies, and the glass, once clear, now carried a faint haze, as if it remembered every guest who'd ever pressed their face against it and whispered to the sea. It was here, just before Christmas, that a young couple, Noah and Lila Winters, checked in for what they thought would be a romantic getaway. They were newlyweds, barely a year into marriage, trying to patch what had already started to fray. The lobby was empty except for a single desk clerk, a thin man with pale eyes and a voice so soft it seemed to come from behind him rather than from his mouth. "Ocean View Suite?" he asked. "Yes," Lila smiled faintly. "Top floor if possible." "Room 912, he replied, sliding the key card forward. His hand brushed hers, and she shivered at how cold his skin felt. The elevator hummed as it climbed, reflecting their faces in its mirrored walls. Two people pretending not to be strangers. The air thickened the higher they went, and when the doors opened, they were met with a long hallway bathed in blue light from the ocean beyond the glass. Every step echoed. The carpet was spotless, too clean, as if freshly replaced for no one in particular. Their room was at the very end. Inside, it was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a balcony overlooking crashing waves, a king-sized bed draped in white linen. Everything gleamed. And yet, as Lila stepped inside, she felt an unease beneath the beauty. The air had a strange weight, a stillness that didn't belong. Noah kissed her shoulder, whispered something about starting fresh, and she tried to smile, but her eyes kept drifting to the reflection in the window. It wasn't their reflection. A faint outline, someone standing near the bed, lingered a moment too long before fading into the dark. They tried to laugh it off. Jet lag, nerves, imagination. But as the night deepened, the hotel seemed to breathe around them. The lights dimmed slightly every few minutes, the sound of the ocean rising and falling like a living thing. Lila awoke just after midnight to the sound of dripping. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. She turned to Noah, but he was still asleep, his face pale in the moonlight. The sound wasn't coming from the bathroom. It was coming from the ceiling. She stood on the bed and shone her phone's flashlight upward. Water spots marked the plaster directly above them, one dark stain spreading outward like a slow heartbeat. She frowned. There hadn't been any rain. When she turned off the light, she could still hear it. Drip, drip, drip. And then, a voice, faint and hollow, whispering from within the walls. "Don't look up." Her breath caught in her throat. She froze, then slowly shook Noah awake. He blinked, groggy, confused. "What is it?" "Someone's," she started, but the ceiling groaned before she could finish. The chandelier trembled, glass beads clinking softly like tiny screams. Then silence. They sat in the dark, listening. Nothing. Noah, irritated and half asleep, muttered something about old pipes, then lay back down. But Lila couldn't. She lay staring at the ceiling until morning, counting the seconds between drips. By dawn, there were stains spreading down the wallpaper, brown and sticky. When she touched it, her fingers came away red. The front desk clerk looked unsurprised when she complained. "We'll send maintenance," he said flatly, eyes distant. "Try not to disturb the ceiling." Later that day, as Noah showered, Lila wandered the hallway. Every door looked the same until she reached 910. Its frame was warped, the paint darker than the rest. She hesitated, pressing her ear against it. Faint static, then a woman's voice humming. The melody was soft, almost motherly, but something about it made her chest tighten. It wasn't the tune itself. It was how close it sounded, as if the woman were standing right behind the door, her mouth near the keyhole. Then the humming stopped, and a whisper followed. "Room 912. Don't look up." Lila stumbled back, heart pounding. She hurried to her own room, but when she opened the door, the lights inside were off. Noah wasn't in the shower anymore. The sound of running water came from above, dripping steadily through the ceiling. She called his name. No answer. She turned toward the balcony. The curtains were moving, though the glass door was shut. Her reflection in the glass wavered, then shifted. For a moment, she saw herself not standing in the room, but outside on the balcony, hair whipping in the wind, eyes hollow. Then it vanished. She backed away, whispering, "Noah!" The bathroom door creaked open on its own. Steam poured out, though the air was freezing cold. Inside, the mirror was fogged over, but there were letters traced into it, written backward from the inside. "Don't look up." Her hand trembled as she wiped the glass. Behind her reflection, something was hanging from the ceiling, pale, swaying slowly, toes brushing the tiles. She turned. Nothing there. Just the slow sound of water dripping again. That night, they decided to check out early. Noah packed in silence while Lila stood by the window, unable to look at the ceiling. As they opened the door to leave, she froze. The hallway stretched impossibly long. Longer than before, lined with doors she didn't remember. The light flickered at the far end. A figure stood there. A woman in a soaked white dress, her head tilted to the side, her face obscured by wet hair. Noah whispered, "Lila, don't." But she stepped forward. The woman raised her arm slowly, pointing toward their room. Lila's stomach turned cold. Her gaze followed the gesture, and then she saw it. The number plate beside their door. It no longer read 912. It read 910. The woman smiled, the corners of her mouth tearing slightly as she whispered the same phrase again. "Don't look up." The lights went out. When the elevator doors opened in the lobby the next morning, there was only one guest inside, Lila. Her hair was wet, eyes blank, skin pale as porcelain. She handed the key card to the clerk with a quiet, trembling voice. "We're checking out." The clerk nodded without looking up. When he finally did, she was gone. He turned the key over in his hand. It didn't say 912. It didn't say 910. It said room 913, a room that didn't exist. Later that day, housekeeping found the suite spotless, but the ceiling was stained a deep, rust-colored red. Maintenance was called. When they cut open the plaster, something fell from inside. An old, water-damaged photograph of a couple standing on the same balcony decades earlier. The man's name, written on the back, was Noah Winters. The date, December 24th, 1974, and scrawled faintly beneath it, in shaky handwriting, "Don't look up." The Redwood Pines Lodge was the kind of place travel blogs called charmingly rustic, tucked deep within a forest that swallowed sunlight whole by mid-afternoon. The cabins were old but cozy, their roofs bowed slightly from years of snowfall. It smelled of cedar, smoke, and rain-soaked moss. Guests came to escape the noise of cities, to unplug, to breathe. But when the storm came that winter, the forest grew too quiet, the kind of silence that feels intentional. Mara and her best friend, Jen, arrived just before the first flakes began to fall. They were both city girls, tired of concrete and chaos, hoping a weekend in the woods might patch the cracks in their friendship. They hadn't spoken much on the drive, each pretending to be absorbed in the music. The tension between them was sharp, old, born from betrayal and words left unsaid. The cabin, at least, was beautiful. Small fireplace, thick quilts, and windows that looked out over miles of black trees. The innkeeper was an older man with a limp, his eyes soft but haunted. He warned them to stay inside once the snow began. "The forest changes after dark," he said quietly. "Voices carry strange here." They laughed it off, assuming it was one of those local legends meant to entertain tourists. Still, when the storm rolled in, howling through the branches like a living thing, the laughter didn't last. By nightfall, the wind had erased the world outside. The windows trembled, and the fire flickered with every gust. Mara was writing in her journal when she noticed Jen staring at the window. Not through it, but at it, eyes wide and unfocused. "What?" Mara asked. Jen didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, listening, then whispered, "Do you hear that?" Mara paused. Beneath the wind, faint but steady, came a sound. Someone calling their names. "Mara, Jen." It was distant, muffled by snow. At first it sounded like a child. Then, after a moment, like a man. Mara forced a laugh. It's just the storm. But Jen was already standing, moving toward the door. Don't, Mara said sharply. It's freezing out there. Jen hesitated, then shook her head. It sounded like my dad. He used to say my name like that. Before Mara could stop her, Jen opened the door. The wind roared inside, scattering papers and ash. The voice grew clearer, calling again. Jen, help me? Her eyes filled with tears. She stepped into the white blur and was gone. Mara screamed, pulling on her boots and coat, grabbing the flashlight from the table. The beam cut through sheets of snow, revealing only shadows of trees bending under the wind. Jen! She yelled, stumbling forward. Her voice was swallowed by the storm. The forest twisted around her, endless and identical. The footprints she followed split into 2 sets, then 3, then vanished entirely. Every direction looked wrong. Then she saw it. A faint glow between the trees, flickering like candlelight. She followed it, desperate. The snow thinned around a clearing, where an old cabin stood half-buried in frost. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Her breath came out in trembling clouds as she stepped closer. The windows were dark except one, the upper left corner, where she could see a figure standing perfectly still. A woman, long hair, pale, watching her. Mara called out, Jen. The woman didn't move. The door creaked open slightly, inviting her in. She hesitated, shining her flashlight inside. The cabin was empty, furniture covered in dust, a fire long dead in the hearth. Cobwebs hung thick in the corners. The light trembled as she stepped across the threshold. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight. Then, behind her, a voice. You shouldn't have followed. She spun around, but no one was there. The door was shut tight. Panic rose in her chest. She aimed the light around the room and froze. Every wall was lined with photographs, hundreds of them, all showing guests standing outside the same Redwood Pines cabins, smiling. Couples, families, friends. Their names were scrawled underneath in red ink. Some of the dates were decades old. Then she saw the most recent one, tacked crookedly to the far wall. It showed her and Jen, taken earlier that day at check-in. Same clothes, same smiles, same background. Only behind them, between the trees, a figure stood watching. Mara staggered backward. The light flickered. The air grew colder. The sound of the storm vanished completely. Then, from somewhere in the dark, the sound of a door creaking open, and soft footsteps moving overhead. She turned her flashlight toward the stairs. A shadow shifted at the top, slow, deliberate. Then came a whisper, this time right beside her ear. Come upstairs, Mara. Her heart thundered. The beam shook as she climbed, each step groaning under her weight. The hall above was lined with mirrors instead of photos. Every reflection showed her moving, but in one of them, Jen was walking behind her. She froze. Jen. The reflection smiled, though her friend's real face was nowhere to be seen. Slowly, the mirror began to fog, words forming across it in frost. We never left. Something moved in the dark, soft, bare feet on wood. Then a hand touched her shoulder, cold as ice. She turned, and for an instant, she saw Jen's face. Pale, wet, eyes wide with terror. Her lips moved soundlessly, mouthing words Mara couldn't hear. Then she was gone, swallowed by shadow. Mara ran. She didn't know where the door was anymore. The hallway seemed to shift, stretching longer, darker. She screamed her friend's name until her throat burned. The mirrors rippled as she passed, each one showing a version of her that looked less and less alive. Finally, she burst through a door and fell face-first into snow. The storm had cleared. The forest was silent again. The sky painted gray with dawn. The cabin behind her was gone. Only a single tree stood in its place, old and gnarled, a weathered wooden sign nailed to its trunk. It read, Redwood Pines Memorial, established 1963. Her body shook uncontrollably. She stumbled back toward the main lodge, half delirious, half frozen. The innkeeper was there, standing on the porch, staring into the woods. His voice was soft when he finally spoke. "You heard her, didn't you?" Mara could barely nod. "Jen, she's still out there." He looked at her sadly. "They all are." Later, when the police came, they found only one set of footprints, Mara's, leading out into the forest and back again. No sign of Jen, no second cabin, no photos. But in Mara's phone, there was one new picture she didn't take. A photo of her standing in the clearing, snow falling around her, and a shadowed figure beside her whispering something that froze her blood when she zoomed in on the caption. Redwood Pines Lodge, 2 guests, 1 checkout. The moon hung low over the valley, casting long shadows through the fog that had settled over the old hilltop asylum. Once a place of rest and refuge for the weary, the building now stood abandoned, its crumbling walls and rusted gates barely holding back the wild growth of ivy that had begun to swallow it whole. The wind howled through the cracked windows, echoing with a history of suffering and whispered secrets. Few dared to go near. Those who did never returned. Ellie Cartwright was different. A documentary filmmaker, she had made a name for herself exploring forgotten places, delving into the darkness of history to uncover truths that others wished remained buried. She had heard the stories about the St. Augustine Asylum, the disappearances, the failed treatments, the whispers of ghosts trapped in the walls. The records, once kept under lock and key, had recently been released to the public, and a strange pattern had emerged, a series of names. People who had checked in but never checked out. All of them had gone missing during the same few months in 1953, with no explanation. Ellie, always drawn to the macabre, couldn't resist. She booked a weekend stay at the old estate, determined to unravel the mystery. As she pulled her car up the long, winding driveway, the place looked even more desolate than she had imagined. The building loomed above her, its sharp angles and stone facade giving it the appearance of a fortress rather than a hospital. She shivered, though the air was warm, and the unsettling quiet seemed to press in from all sides. The gate had long since rusted shut, but she stepped over the low fence, flashlight in hand, and made her way to the front door. Inside, the smell of mold and mildew hit her immediately. The hallway stretched before her, lined with broken doors and shattered glass. Papers were scattered across the floor, some yellowed and curling, others still crisp and white. Ellie set up her camera and started her walk through the building, narrating her findings as she went. The place was a labyrinth. Some rooms were locked, others had been left wide open, their contents decaying with time. Old medical equipment lay forgotten. Dark stains splashed across the floors as though the building itself had absorbed the tragedies within its walls. The deeper she ventured, the more she felt it. The heaviness of the place, like the air itself, was thick with sorrow and regret. Each room was filled with remnants of lives that had been erased, documents that were torn or burned, as if someone had tried to erase the past. She found an old journal, its pages brittle and yellow, detailing the life of a nurse who had worked here in the early 1950s. She had written about strange happenings, unexplained noises, and a growing sense of dread that seemed to follow the patients who were admitted during that time. The shadows, the nurse had written, are watching. Ellie felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She continued down the hall, the shadows deepening as the moonlight failed to reach the lower levels. There was an unsettling calm that seemed to follow her every move, like the building itself was holding its breath. She reached the basement door, and for a moment, the camera's light flickered. Her heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. But she pushed forward, her curiosity outweighing her caution. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a staircase leading into darkness. She descended, her flashlight casting long, wavering beams on the cracked walls. The air here was even colder, and Ellie's breath formed clouds in front of her face. As she reached the bottom, the flashlight revealed a long corridor lined with cells. Some were empty, their bars rusted and bent. Others still held remnants of what had been: old beds, cracked porcelain sinks, scraps of clothing. The stench of rot hung in the air. She paused at one of the cells, drawn to a faded photograph pinned to the wall. The image was of a woman, young, her eyes wide with fear. The name beneath it read Margaret Hale, missing 1953. Ellie's pulse quickened. This was one of the names she had found in the records. A woman who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, never to be heard from again. Suddenly, there was a sound behind her. A faint scrape, like something dragging against the floor. Ellie spun around, but there was no one there. She stood still, straining to hear, her breath caught in her throat. The scraping continued, but it was softer now, almost like a whisper. It was coming from the end of the corridor. Against her better judgment, Ellie walked toward the noise. As she moved deeper into the basement, the temperature dropped even further. The flashlight flickered again, and for a moment the beam went out completely. She cursed under her breath and hit the side of the flashlight, willing it to work. It flickered back to life, but the beam was weak, and the shadows seemed to stretch further. The scraping sound was louder now, closer. Ellie turned a corner, and there it was, a door, slightly ajar, its hinges squeaking softly. She pushed it open, the sound reverberating in the stillness. Inside, the room was small, the walls covered in peeling paint. At first, it seemed empty, but then she saw it. In the corner, near the far wall, a figure was crouched down, its back to her. Ellie took a step forward, her camera now trembling in her hands. "Hello?" she called out softly, but the figure didn't respond. She took another step, her voice growing more urgent. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't move. But then, just as Ellie was about to turn and leave, a raspy voice echoed from the darkness, thin and broken. "Help me." Ellie's blood ran cold. The voice sounded wrong, distorted, as if it was being pulled through the walls. She stepped closer, but just as she reached out, the figure stood up quickly, turning around with a violent jerk. What she saw made her gasp in shock. The figure was a woman, but her face was twisted and decayed. The skin pulled taut over her bones, her eyes wide and glassy. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, teeth yellowed and jagged. She reached toward Ellie, her hand outstretched, the nails long and broken. "Help me," the voice repeated, but this time it was not a plea. It was a command. Ellie stumbled backward, her heart racing. She turned and ran, but as she did, the temperature plummeted, and the walls seemed to close in on her. She could hear the woman's footsteps behind her, dragging across the floor. Ellie reached the stairs and bolted up, the light flickering wildly, but the air grew heavier with each step. When she reached the main floor, the doors were locked. Desperately, she tried the handle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The door wouldn't budge. Behind her, she could hear the woman's voice. Louder now, closer, echoing down the hallway. "You can't leave. You belong to me now." Ellie screamed, but no one was there to hear it. The walls around her seemed to pulse, alive with a malevolent force. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and she realized, with a sickening certainty, that she was not alone in the asylum. The past had come alive, and it was hungry. The next morning, the film crew that had been waiting for Ellie outside found nothing but her camera on the steps of the asylum. There was no sign of her, and the doors to the building were locked as tightly as they had been for years. The footage on the camera, when they reviewed it, showed only static. And then, before the camera cut out entirely, they heard it. The same voice. "Help me." The early morning mist curled like smoke through the narrow streets of Millwood, a quiet town nestled at the edge of a forest that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a place that, at first glance, seemed like any other sleepy community, the kind where people knew each other's names and gossip spread faster than the morning sun. But beneath its calm exterior, something darker lived in the shadows, something that the locals never spoke of. Nathan, a freelance photographer, had recently come to Millwood to escape the hustle of the city, hoping that the stillness of the town might inspire his work. He had rented a small room at the town's only inn, an old stone building that looked as though it had been built long before electricity had come to the area. The innkeeper, a wiry woman named Agnes, had greeted him with a forced smile and a lingering look that Nathan couldn't place. The first few days were uneventful. Nathan wandered the quiet streets, snapping photos of the dense woods, the crumbling stone walls of the old church, and the overgrown cemetery on the hill. The fog that rolled through the town each morning seemed to add a layer of mystery to everything, and Nathan couldn't resist capturing it on film. But the more time he spent in Millwood, the more unsettled he became. There was something about the place, something wrong. On the fourth night, after an evening of too much wine and too little sleep, Nathan wandered out into the woods. The trees here grew thick and close together, their roots tangled and their branches heavy with moss. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive, as though the very earth was holding its breath. He wasn't sure what had drawn him this far into the woods. Perhaps it was the isolation of the town that had made him feel like a voyeur in a place where no one seemed to want outsiders. Or perhaps it was the strange feeling he had every time he passed the cemetery. A sense of being watched, of being drawn toward something hidden just out of sight. As he walked, the fog began to thicken. The path, barely visible beneath the dense foliage, seemed to shift and twist in strange, unnatural ways. The trees, once mere shadows, now seemed to loom over him like sentinels. He stumbled, his breath coming in short gasps, until he finally broke through to a clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, stood a large stone monument, worn with age but still imposing. The carvings on its surface were faded, but Nathan could make out a few words. "Here lies the last of Millwood's founding families. The price for their legacy was paid in full." The message sent a shiver down his spine. It was a simple epitaph, but it didn't sit right with him. Who had placed this stone here, and why was it hidden in the depths of the forest? What price had been paid? His curiosity got the better of him. Nathan took out his camera and snapped a photo, but as he did, the air around him seemed to freeze. The stillness became suffocating, and he suddenly felt like he wasn't alone. Slowly, he turned around. At the edge of the clearing, standing just beyond the trees, was a figure. A woman. Her face was hidden by the hood of her cloak, but there was something about her posture, her stillness, that made Nathan's heart race. She was watching him. "Nathan," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "You shouldn't have come here." Nathan's blood ran cold. How did she know his name? Before he could speak, the fog thickened, swallowing her figure whole. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The clearing was empty. Panic surged through Nathan's chest as he tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself was holding him back. He turned in every direction, trying to find the path back, but the woods had changed. The trees now seemed to twist into unfamiliar shapes, their branches reaching out like fingers. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. He fell, crashing through the earth, and landed hard on something soft, wet, cold. As he struggled to get to his feet, his hands sank into the wet soil, and he froze. The soil wasn't just wet. It was alive. A hand shot up from the ground, grabbing his wrist, and another from the dark earth reached for his leg. He screamed, but no sound came out. The forest had closed in around him. He was no longer alone. The last thing Nathan saw, before the darkness consumed him, was a face emerging from the ground. A twisted, grotesque version of the woman in the cloak, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. The next morning, Agnes found Nathan's camera on the doorstep of the inn. The lens cracked and shattered. His last photo, the one of the stone monument, was perfectly clear. But in the background, faintly visible through the fog, there was something else. The shadow of a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. The innkeeper stared at the photo for a long time before gently placing it in the drawer, locking it away with the others. It was just another part of Millwood's history, another visitor who had gotten too close to the truth. And that truth, Agnes knew, would never let anyone leave. Alex wasn't a believer in ghosts or curses, but there was something about this case that gnawed at him. The missing family had been seen last at the farm on a cold winter evening. Then the trail went cold. No one had lived here for over 20 years, but when Alex first stepped on the property, he felt the unmistakable weight of eyes upon him. Not figuratively. Something was watching him, hidden just out of sight, lurking in the corners of his vision. He moved deeper into the house, flashlight cutting through the dark. The further he went, the more oppressive the silence became. It wasn't just quiet. It was waiting. The storm had passed, but the town of Harrow's Hill had not returned to normal. The roads were flooded, the trees bent and broken, and the houses eerily quiet. The air still smelled of rain and something far worse, decay. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the gray clouds, a figure appeared at the edge of the woods, walking slowly toward town. It was Victor Graves. He had vanished years ago. His name had once been a part of Harrow's Hill's darkest secret, a disappearance that never had an explanation. But there he was, alive, covered in dirt, his eyes empty. He didn't speak to anyone as he passed by, not even when a woman called his name from a porch. Instead, his hollow gaze moved ahead, as if following an invisible trail only he could see. People whispered, staring in disbelief, but no one dared approach. As Victor continued on, the shadows seemed to follow him, wrapping tighter and tighter around his form. The town had forgotten how to breathe. By noon, he was gone. The old carnival grounds were silent now, the rusted Ferris wheel barely visible against the darkened sky. Once a place of laughter and lights, it had been abandoned for years, but for some reason, it still held an eerie pull. When Jake found himself standing at the gates that night, he couldn't explain why he had come. Only that something had drawn him here, a curiosity too powerful to ignore. As he pushed through the creaking gate, a soft, unsettling melody echoed from somewhere in the distance. The sound was familiar, like an old carnival tune, but there was something off about it, as if it was being played backward. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, the grass overgrown and tangled in the pathways. The once bright colors of the rides had faded, leaving them covered in grime, their shapes distorted by years of neglect. Jake felt a shiver crawl up his spine, but he pressed on, determined to find out what lay beyond the shadows. When he reached the center of the fairground, he saw it, the old carousel standing still, its horses frozen mid-gallop. The music came from within it, a distorted version of a tune he remembered from his childhood. But as he drew closer, the lights flickered on, and something caught his eye, the reflection in the glass. There were people on the carousel, their faces obscured by shadows, but their eyes were locked on him, unblinking. He couldn't move, paralyzed by the chilling gaze of the figures, and in that moment, the music stopped. The carousel began to spin on its own. Jake stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat, but before he could run, the carousel's horses began to move. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, until the figures on them began to shift, their forms becoming more distinct. Their faces twisted, melting, becoming grotesque in the flickering light. Suddenly, the air grew thick with the smell of burnt rubber, the ground trembling beneath his feet. The carnival lights flared brightly, blinding him. He heard laughter. Not the joyous sound of a carnival, but the deep, mocking laughter of something far older. The laughter echoed in his head, louder and louder, until it felt like it was coming from inside him. Jake turned to run, but the ground below him had turned to muck, sticky and cold. His legs sank into the earth, his movements sluggish, like something was holding him down. He screamed, but no sound escaped his mouth. The laughter grew louder. Then, just as the figures on the carousel reached out toward him, the world went black. In the morning, when the town awoke, the carnival was gone. There were no signs of it, no traces, no evidence it had ever been there. Only the faintest smell of burnt rubber lingered in the air, and a single twisted horse's mask was found buried in the mud at the foot of Greendale Hill. No one spoke of it, but for the rest of the town, the laughter never stopped. The woods were silent, their dark trees standing like sentinels beneath the fading moonlight. Claire had been running for what felt like hours, her breath ragged and her legs burning with exhaustion. The distant howls of wolves echoed through the trees, a reminder of how far she had ventured into the wilderness. She stumbled over branches and rocks, her flashlight flickering as the batteries slowly drained. The sound of her footsteps was muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following her. She stopped, listening. Nothing. But then a whisper. "Come back." Claire froze. The voice was faint, distorted by the wind, but it was unmistakable. She turned around, her heart in her throat. But there was nothing behind her, just the dark expanse of the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. And yet the voice came again. "Come back." This time it was closer, and Claire could feel it in her bones. Something was there, just out of sight, waiting.